Good afternoon to all those who are watching us in Europe. Good morning to those who are in America. This is the live streaming of the international panel dealing with the post-COVID-19 world and the international consequences for Russia. My name is David Stulik. I'm from the Prague-based civil society, from the European Values think tank. I'll be the moderator of today's debate. And this is the online discussion co-hosted together by our organization and by the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. So we are very grateful to our American colleagues to join us for this effort. And let me briefly introduce our panelists. We have here a very distinguished guests. We have here Егор Куроптев, who is the director of the Free Russia Foundation in South Caucasus, and now he's based in Georgia. We have here former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Mr. Pavlo Klymkin, who is now based in Kiev. And we have also here Ambassador John Herbst, who is the director of the Eurasia Center in the Atlantic Council, based in the US. And last but not least, we have here with us Rebbeka Harms, a well-known former member of the European Parliament, who is now based in Germany. So as announced, our discussion will be dealing with domestic and international aspects of the post-COVID reality and its implication on Russia. All of you, our audience, will have a chance to ask the questions at the link that is provided to you under the video, under the YouTube video that you are watching. It's at the website of the Slido. So if you have any questions, please send them to this website, fill in the form there, and you will then have a chance to hear your questions online. Right, so we are going to divide our talk in 3 blocks. During the first block, we will discuss the current situation in Russia. Then we will move on to Putin's strategy and policy options that are resulting from this situation. And the last block will be focused on the West strategy and approach towards Russia that is also changing, like most of the countries in the world, as a result of this coronavirus pandemic. So first, as I said, we will discuss the current situation in Russia. And here I would like to ask Егор to make a short introduction to on this issue. So Егор, the screen floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. I want to say thanks, first of all, the Atlantic Council and European Values Center for initiating the discussion. As for situation in Russia, you know, it's difficult to talk about it because when I talk to my relatives and friends who live in different cities and different regions of Russia, they say, and it surprised me a little bit, that they don't see even the word that is announced by the government. So what we could see during this period for months already is government saying that we are helping making them pay taxes after 3 months period by paying some 3,000 rubles additionally to unemployed families with children. For our audience to understand, 3,000 rubles is, I don't know, about $40. So, of course, it's not something that could save you even during a month. And measures launched by the government today, the new package was announced of support to people, to companies. These measures are not helping today. So, for example, if some support is announced, you have so many bureaucracy and so many proofs you provide to different kind of, I don't know, banks, organizations, and etc. You will never receive this help. So you will maybe receive it after a few months. And to prove as an evidence of this situation, we can see the situation in Vladikavkaz in North Ossetia, where protest activity happened even during quarantine, and people went out. Yes, propaganda machine and disinformation is trying to assure Russian citizens that these people protested against, I don't know, the existence of the virus, as they say in state media, and unfortunately even in democratic media, as we call it. But in reality, what we see in Vladimir Kavkaz is people who did not get any support, any financial help, any help in regard with utility bills, for example. Governments say that covering utility bills is populism, and we don't need to do it. But people on places, in regions especially, maybe Moscow is a bit better, but like North Ossetia is one of the regions of Russia where people usually all the time, not only in the period of coronavirus, experience huge problems with jobs, even with food. So now these people went out and they protested. And what we can see, and what maybe is really important from my point of view, that for the first time I remember in Russia, police representatives, when they had an order to aggressively disperse this protest, they said no, and they just left. They didn't. So governments had to call police representatives from other regions to disperse this protest. And now I talk to these people in Vladimir Kavkaz. Now these people are being threatened by local authorities. They're being pushed to record videos, everything is good, and we receive support from authorities, and etc., etc. So what I want to say is, yes, as usually, they say that they do stuff. They implement some measures to support, for example, business, and they didn't give some vote in regard with taxes. They make them pay these taxes after 3 months. And for business, it's not some kind of way out because they're closing anyway. And lots of people will lose their jobs. So from the one hand, what we see, for example, in regard with Vladimir Kavkaz situation, is government, central government attempt to block any kind of news in regard with like negative attitude and any kind of fact-based news in regard with protests, with hunger, with people starving, with families don't have access to normal medicine and I don't know, some equipment, medical equipment they need to protect themselves during that period. They're trying and doing everything they can to block this information flow, not to spread it in other regions. So at the moment, they really feel fear, and this Vladimir Kavkaz case shows it very well. Because even, and it's like, for me, it's very sad to say that, because even pro-democratic or normal, let's say, media outlets, and we have some, very few in Russia, unfortunately very few, they cannot say truth already. They're prohibited from distribution of unbiased information. And of course, as in any normal country, when you don't have information, you can't like move in proper direction. So at the first stage, they didn't provide information regarding the virus. They were saying that it's fine, it's okay, we don't have it in Russia, there is no need for some emergency state, and etc., etc. At the second stage, they said, yes, we have the virus, finally, thanks a lot, but they're not implementing, launching this emergency state, because if they do it, they must pay money to people, they must pay compensations and different kind of support. But they don't want to do it.
Thank you, Yegor, for this very informative insight. And let's use your, let's say, messages as a kickoff to our debate. I would like to ask any of the other speakers whether they would like to add on that point.
Firstly, it's great to be back with friends. Unfortunately, on a kind of online communication platform. Yegor, many thanks for your great overview. Let me just to map out a couple of points, because I've been following Russia also quite closely for all these years, but also recent months. My first point, I don't believe what has been happening now in Russia could kind of create a game changer. We are But definitely, recent developments opened a kind of Pandora box on many issues. And in the future, it could lead to points of no returns. Firstly, I see what I would call a kind of desacralization of Putin's personal image. He came up with ideas on social initiatives, and his approval ratings actually went down. It's about the whole unbelievable, I would say, mind-blowing situation on oil, and we're going to talk about that in the future. It's about this vertical and local link, which for me is functioning as before, and there is a degree of uncertainty there. But this degree of desacralization would be difficult to reimburse in the future. And I believe there is kind of considerable, I would say really considerable threat that Russia and Putin himself would try to reimburse it with a kind of external legitimacy and external bit of sacralization. Secondly, look, some things which actually happened are totally mind-blowing. For example, the Russian Orthodox Church is now in a kind of opposition to the Russian authorities, which was totally, mind-blowing just 3 months ago. And even Putin's speeches, where he keeps coming up with all kind of ideas on how economy would work or should work in the future, actually show his weakness, because it's not about him. It's not about a national leader to be in charge of everything. It was not like that in the past, where Putin was actually kind of national leader, delivering on key issues and communicating directly with people, not through bureaucracy. So for me, a lot of things which have been happening now are not just normal management of the crisis. They in a way could not lead to a new normal. So we could discuss foreign policy stuff in a more detail in a couple of minutes. But fundamentally, what I see is really a kind of process of internal desacralization on economy, on kind of communication between Putin and the Russians, on communication through bureaucracy, different kind of bickering between the Russian elites is there. And it would be interesting to get, because we don't have probably enough time of that. What could that all lead in the sense of projection of Russian future in internal policy? I have my ideas, especially for the foreign policy, but now I believe we have kind of new situation, not just with problems piling up, but with a kind of completely different mentality twist coming in Russia. It's what I wanted to mention for the start of this discussion.
I'd just like to add a few data points to the conversation. First, Mr. Putin was late recognizing the problem of coronavirus. Serious actions only took place after it was forced by Mayor Sobyanin in Moscow, because Moscow has been the epicenter of the problem in Russia. There are now, 93,000 cases this morning, according to the internet, of COVID cases in Russia, 48,000 in Moscow. So Putin was late, and as already mentioned, uncharacteristically, he has handed off responsibility of this to the regional governors, perhaps because he's not sure what to do. We have also seen signs of problems in the medical field in Moscow the top coronavirus hospital in Moscow, the nurses walked out yesterday saying they were not given the necessary equipment, protective gear to handle this, a sign of things coming apart. You also have this heroic doctor, I think her name is Anastasia Vasilyeva, in the Novgorod Oblast, who has been trying to organize doctors under the Alliance of Doctors. And she was arrested briefly and, in fact, beaten up for talking about the inadequacies of the public response to the problem of COVID-19. So we see bits and pieces of disarray in Russia as this problem is being addressed. And the implications of that, well, we'll probably discuss that in the next segment of this conversation.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for these remarks. So let's now move to the second block of the questions or issues that we want to raise. And these are the Putin's options, policy options. We know that he was planning to have that public vote on the amendments to the constitution. As already Yegor mentioned, the military parade on the 9th of May was cancelled. We heard Pavlo Klimkin saying that Putin's image has been desacralized. So what sort of ways out Mr. Putin has?
Okay, if I may start.
Yes, Igor, please go ahead.
Yeah. What I wanted to say, because I discussed this issue with my friends and colleagues from Europe and United States, observing and thinking about what will happen, what ways he has, and etc., is that post-COVID Russia that we discussed today is the same Putin's Russia that it was before coronavirus. It's very important. Yes, maybe, not maybe, for sure, we now have a huge crisis in regard with the economy and, of course, some social protest, but it's not something huge in regard with making them leave and be responsible for what they do. So, for example, it's symbolic for me that European Values Center based in Prague is initiating this discussion now when Kremlin the whole month attack Prague and Czech Republic in regard with, for example, for me, very, very important issue as Boris Nemtsov Square that was opened in Prague near Russian embassy. And in normal country, democratic country, normal country, it's better to say normal, I think, because in Russia, the word democracy is already like something not good. It is, of course. So in normal country, authorities will have to say thanks a lot and express a gratitude to Czech Republic, to Prague, city council that voted for renaming one of the squares to like remember the 5th anniversary of the killing of Russian oppositioner, representative of Russian opposition, Boris Nemtsov, our friend. But not doing it, what they do is threatening democratic society. Mayor of Prague, who is now under protection of Czech police. Now in 2020, when we see the pandemic of coronavirus, someone trying to haunt democratic societies instead of supporting its population, it's something like, for me, it's outstanding. And what we need to understand from my point of view, I mean experts communities and like societies in Europe and America, that Putin's Russia is using this pandemic to manipulate all of us, Russian Democrats, foreign normal societies, and etc. They're using the huge disinformation campaign. They're using all high rules they do use all the time, but even more and more. Not only against Czech Republic, because of some different issues, not only this Boris Nemtsov Square, there are some other issues as well, but also against Italy, against France, where they try to build bridges with President Macron all the time. But as an answer, France received disinformation spread, manipulations, information that European Union is not helping in any way, that Europe failed, democracy failed, and never failed. And actually only Putin succeeds everywhere. When his people, his countrymen, suffer from hunger. So the point is, to be like short, the point is, yes, of course, we can like see the future of Russia. We have to think about what will happen. From my point of view, Putin will use all possible tools to keep doing what he did. And it's not for good for Russian people. It's not for good for the international security and stability. And they will, this KGB regime will keep like pushing everyone to stay in power, to succeed with this vote that they like change the date. I mean, constitutional changes. I don't know whether you know or not, for example, you in Czech Republic or our friends in other countries, that yes, of course, the date is changed, but all TV channels 24 hours a day broadcast commercials that, yeah, people support us and you will protect Russian language, support constitutional changes and you will protect Russian culture or history. They don't say that if you support them, you will protect Putin's regime staying in power forever. They don't say it. They say about Russian language and other stuff. So what we, from my point of view as Russian citizen, as person who like really want Russia to be a better place, as Boris Nemtsov wanted and dreamed about before, is to like concentrate, we can push this regime to go, to leave, to stop being in power. Which measures we could implement again and again to succeed in this? Not pushing the people of the country because they're already pushed a lot. They can't, majority of population, they don't have foreign passports. They never visited any country in the world. So it's very easy to manipulate the society when your society is sitting in the village eating nothing.
Right. Yegor, I see that Rebecca has raised her hand, so she would like to also comment on this issue. Yep.
Yes. Does it work?
Go.
Yes, we do hear you. Yes, please.
So nice to be with you, and also very interesting to listen to Yegor so far. I would like to say that I have not that much to contribute about what has to happen in Russia or directly to achieve change in Russia. I think in this very moment in Europe, you can see it very well. So one continent, if you observe it during Corona crisis, you can see very well that this Corona crisis makes visible in all the countries and in the different systems, the strengths and the weakness of society. These positive and negative experiences, I'm still thinking about what it means, but so while in the EU there is, for example, very intense talk whether the Swedish or the German model works better, I'm convinced that this is the wrong battle. So I would say that those systems, those countries in which the leadership does not impose the measures on the citizens, but is convincing the citizens and is working with measures based on the trust of citizens in the measures, in quite tough measures partly, those systems will come out strengthened from this Corona crisis. And what I feel as a real need is to have still more positive communications about the experiences in the democratic societies in this crisis, and to let also the citizens, for example, in Russia, know about how we are trying to cope with this crisis. For the European Union, you might have also followed the many debates about the European Union. So this is really a moment, again, to prove the stability, the unity, and the fundamental principle of the European Union, the solidarity when it's needed. And in the very first moment of this crisis, everybody was only shouting that we might see soon the end of the European Union. I think the opposite is right. That based on the problematic situation that the European Union has no direct responsibility for the health sector, meanwhile, the response of the European Union in this crisis is pretty strong, internally and even externally in the neighborhood. For Russian citizens, it might be very interesting to learn about all those ongoing solidarity measures. I was really shocked how much attention was given to these, what among friends we also called white convoys to Italy. Huge attention, yeah, a huge scoop for Russian propaganda, while there is close to zero attention to much more efficient support measures for all our EAP Eastern partners. Yeah. In addition, I would also say that it should be much better known how much money the European Union is preparing now for immediate use to cover social needs in the EU member states caused by corona crisis. These short work allowances, which can be now paid additionally by the European budget. It's a huge social measure. It has not existed in the European Union ever before. That they are preparing in Brussels 1,000 billion euro to cover the economic and social needs in the aftermath of corona crisis already now is also quite impressive. And I think so to compete with what Putin has to offer should not be as difficult as some people make it. I feel sometimes reminded to what we always said to our Ukrainian friends, Pavlo might remember. So you will not only beat Putin on the front line, but you will beat Putin by doing the reforms.
Yes, thank you very much, Rebecca, for this insight from the European Union's point of view. We are already receiving, I would say, kind of a flood of questions to all of our, let's say, of our panelists. So there's a one specific question which is related to the options of Mr. Putin that is addressed to Ambassador Herbst. Do you see the current pandemic and the way how it is handled by Moscow that it could weaken or would weaken the regime? So what is your take on that?
I don't think there's any question that it will weaken the regime. Just like the impact of sanctions and low oil prices before this pandemic, when Mr. Putin, and it led to a drop in Russian GNP in the first year in 2015 of over 3%, but the drop in the standard of living was over 9%. And that differential has continued to this day. And just as Mr. Putin used his resources to buck up his cronies like the Rothenbergs and Timchenko in those times, and he imposed taxes on the long-distance truckers in Russia, which led to protests. Well, we're seeing something similar today. As already mentioned, Russia has this enormous reserve fund, and it is not being used for social welfare purposes. Mr. Putin, who likes to put himself at the center of all things important for Russia, is running away and saying the regional governor should handle COVID-19. So this will be further evidence to the Russian people that Mr. Putin's objectives are not dealing with their basic needs. Now, that does not necessarily mean that the regime is going to disappear. It just means that Mr. Putin's own position, his popularity, will be weakened. And in fact, if the stunning impact on hydrocarbon prices of the pandemic continues, right? Oil, I saw yesterday closed, Brent was under $20 a barrel. And West Texas Intermediate was like $11 a barrel. Those are incredible prices. Incredibly bad for Mr. Putin, since what, 30% Russian GDP depends upon hydrocarbons, and 60% of Russian export depend upon hydrocarbons. Now, I'm not an oil expert. I'm not going to say that these prices will remain for 2 or 3 or 4 years. But if they do, that will have a major impact on the Putin regime and will definitely force belt tightening, including perhaps in his adventurous foreign policy. It's worth remembering that the Soviet Union came apart after over half decade of low oil prices.
Yeah, thank you. We are also receiving some questions that are related to possible alternatives to Mr. Putin. And there is also a question of one of our colleagues coming from Ukraine saying that what sort of alternative there is in Russia if all the opposition parties and leaders are so weak. So is there any alternative to Mr. Putin in Russia?
I'll just make a couple of very general points. No one was predicting, say, in 1788, that this edifice of the French monarchy was going to become undone in a year or two, and it happened. The amazing thing about authoritarian regimes is that they seem to be unstoppable until suddenly they disappear. The same was true of very few people. I know of no one who predicted the end of the Soviet Union, except for Amalrik, who wrote his famous book in the early 70s. I mean, I was working on these issues from the State Department, and no one was predicting the Soviet Union would come apart. So we don't know what's going to happen in Russia. We do know that they've entered a period of stagnation. We do know that between oil prices and COVID-19, they're taking a major hit. We do know that Russia's fighting an unsuccessful war in Ukraine and Donbass, and the Russian people want no part of it. All these things add up to nothing good for Mr. Putin and his regime. And I think it's possible but unlikely that Mr. Putin would be replaced by someone even less tolerable to people who like democratic values.
I have never been a friend of deciding from the outside whether there is a person or a group which can create alternative leadership in a foreign country. But so following the development in Russia from the outside, I would say it's still impressive how often Navalny had to go to prison. So there is something as a real strength in this man. Otherwise, the system could cope in a more intelligent way, probably with him. So to imprison him again and again is a sign of real weakness. And what already John Hurst mentioned, the story of this medical doctor who was detained while bringing medical equipment, protection equipment to hospitals in the regions. So also a sign that there are strong people in Russia opposing to what the regime is doing. And this is, for me, again and again, also a sign that change will be possible.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I don't see that Pavlo Klimkin is still with us. So then, Yegor, please, you also wanted to say a few words on that.
Yeah, just shortly to say that our friends from other countries should be sure, Pavlo is back, should be sure that there are lots of strong and people ready to oppose the current regime, not only Alexei Navalny. First of all, of course, he's the most well-known person, but lots of other people in regions who are creating some small groups, and they want to move, they want to act, but they don't have this opportunity. And one short remark. Unfortunately, in regard with European experience countering coronavirus and other threats and providing support to people, it's very difficult to reach people in Russia, especially in regions, because they don't have any access to this information, and all media are blocking it and they're saying false. So it's my work as well to do it, and it's a very huge challenge to reach a big amount of people if you don't have access to in Russia, or huge funds to distribute it on digital platforms. So it's a challenge we should all work on as well if we're interested in developments of Russian society. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, we now have Pavlo Klимkin back with us on the streaming. I saw that you were raising the hand and you wanted to comment on the possible alternatives to Mr. Putin, the issue of the political opposition in Russia. Yes, so now I'll give the floor to you.
If you see the challenges in Russia, internal challenges, and they are definitely piling up. If you analyze these challenges, there are no simple and definitely no popular solutions to these problems. As simple as that. The second point, I believe that Putin will try to reimburse internal problems with external drive and external sacralizations. Whether it's Ukraine or something else, we could discuss it further. For example, Donbass now has become not just for its foreign policy problem for Russia. It has been never actually clearly foreign policy problem for Russia. But now it's a part of Russian internal policy agenda, in the sense of giving up on Donbass, or perception of giving up on Donbass would create a fundamentally negative spin for Putin himself, not for Russia. It's important to understand, but for Putin himself. Third point, in the sense of what's going on in Russia, we have Putin as the president of Russia and the kind of physical personality, but we also have two, so to say, collective Putins. One is, it's Russian people, and 75% of Russian people basically keep missing the Soviet Union. It's about completely different type of mentalities than, for example, in Ukraine, but also another collective Putin. And we are speaking here about Russian elites. They could be bickering against each other on many problems, but on external issues, on foreign policy issues, they are completely on the same side. So I believe, and I completely agree with John here, that the Russian model is not sustainable. It should be reloaded. Not now, we are not in that moment, but it should be reloaded. Whether it should be reloaded in the sense of Putin's personality or more, we can say it's pure speculation. But it's completely clear that Putin will try, because he understands the situation, to raise the stakes. He will try to raise the stakes now, before possible entering into a kind of bigger deal with the West. Let's call it kind of collective West or whatever. Because many people in Putin environment clearly understand that such a deal is needed to make Russia sustainable. But for Putin, is a kind of sense of mission to expand back to the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. And if you see this scrap, and I mean scrap in English sense and scrap in the sense of Russian language, all the senses and ideologies, which has been included back into the proposals for Russian constitutions, you see that now Pandora box is open on politics in Russia, on economy in Russia, and on ideology. World War II, 9th of May. So on all three fundamental dimensions, there should be a bit of reload in the future. But before that, and I'm quite sure that Putin will try to raise the stakes externally, and it's not probably just about Ukraine, because simple and popular solutions for existing problems in Russia, they are simply not there. And my last, very simple point. We've been trying to analyze Putin's behavior and Russian behavior from a kind of rational point of view. But Putin's behavior has been always a kind of mixture of purely rational and irrational factors. And under this pressure and under all these decisions, which basically went terribly wrong for him personally also, not just for Russia, management of coronavirus, economy, World War II ideology, everything. He basically feels this pressure to do something. So, and it's not just unpredictability, it's also about kind of irrational drive. You could feel there, and just have a look at the expert discussion now in Russia. People started talking again about coronavirus crisis, basically creating a sort of different stance on the reload of the Soviet Union. It's quite interesting. It's always a kind of preparation for something else. So my point, internal problems will be, or could be, tried to manage, at least by Putin and his environment, with a sort of different drive. And it could be just external drive, or a kind of way to talk to the West from a fundamentally stronger point of view, because now it's widely felt in Russia that the Russian point is fundamentally weaker and not enough to have a good chat with the West, and it's a kind of mixture of rational and irrational here, and we should understand that.
Yeah, thank you very much for these remarks. I saw that Rebecca wanted to speak, so Rebecca, you wanted to react to what Pavlo Klymkin just said, right?
Yeah, so he shortly mentioned Donbass, and I think it deserves special attention in this Corona challenge, because Donbass was always a war in which very vulnerable people suffered mostly, especially also elderly people. And the refusal for a true ceasefire, at least during this pandemic, is, from my point of view, a very, very serious reason for the Europeans and the Americans to refuse any debate about the end of sanctions. But it's also very necessary to make the very problems of Donbass more known. So you cope in Prague a lot with the propaganda by Russia. And I think we have to do more to undermine the Russian fake news and half-truths disseminated all over European countries than to dismantle the lies. We have to do more to make known what is the impact of Russian strategy on Europeans, on European territory. For example, in Donbass, or Yegor in the very beginning mentioned Ossetia. So I think, even if it sounds quite challenging, so especially also the consequences, the severe consequences of Corona in Donbass for elderly people, in a region where hospitals often have no running water and are far away from having always clean water or hot water, where many people in the villages and even in a city with like Mariupol in the south, they have no access to good water in the apartments. So the consequences of the war, the consequences of refusal of ceasefire in this corona crisis should be much more known in the West and especially in the European Union.
Right. Before we give a floor to Yegor, who would like to also speak, let me address Ambassador Herbst with this question. You wrote like 2 weeks ago, together with your other fellow former ambassadors to Ukraine, an article for National Public Radio saying that right now it might be, or it can be easier to talk to Mr. Putin exactly about the situation and the solution for peaceful solution for Donbass. So maybe you would like to address this point right now in this part of our discussion.
Well, this takes off on something I already said, which is that COVID-19 has been a blow to Mr. Putin, but more importantly, the drop in hydrocarbon prices has been a major blow to the Kremlin. If these prices continue for months and months and months, extending into years, the Kremlin's ability to pursue an adventurous foreign policy, which is expensive, will diminish. That's the main point. We know there are smart people in Moscow, people of some influence, who recognize that Moscow's war in Donbass is a failure. Mr. Putin does not. But if 2 years from now, oil prices remain at $20 a barrel or less, Mr. Putin will not have the means to pursue these sorts of policies without paying a price at home. So that's my point. If he's forward thinking about his own well-being as a leader of Russia, he may need to make some adjustments. And if he does, the United States and Ukraine should be prepared, and the EU should be prepared to respond. Yeah. But I'm not predicting, and we weren't predicting something immediate, something over time.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much for explaining your position on that. So now I will switch to Yegor, who wanted to raise something on that issue. Yegor?
Yeah, I would like just to add something, because I think it is a must to understand for some audiences in Europe and the United States who are thinking that maybe, for example, in this situation in regard with the virus, we can talk to Putin and etc. For example, this month, April 2020, when the virus was everywhere already, in Georgia, where I am based for 8 years already, we see the FSB engineering forces building new occupation lines deeper inside of the Georgian territory. So, of course, it's not a hot war as it is in Ukraine, but it's a minimum hybrid war taking place in Georgia every day, and it's not stopping. And we can see briefings of Maria Zakharova, weekly briefings, and we can notice that she's talking each week about bad Czech Republic and Russia, Putin's Russia, trying to affect Prague authorities in regard with Victory Day, in regard with everything. This Nemtsov Square, they talk about Georgia and American laboratory building Georgia by on American funds. Yeah, it's Lugar Lab, very famous lab, and they're saying that Pentagon is developing viruses in this laboratory, not saying that, for example, only because of this laboratory developed in Georgia, we have the minimum number of people being sick with this virus and normal situation, actually. So what I want to highlight is for all of us not to look at some steps that Putin is making at the moment to withdraw sanctions, to make all of us sure that they will be better. They will not, unfortunately. So Russian people, from my understanding, me, my relatives, my friends, I don't know, at least I will not talk from all Russian people. What we believe that we don't need, for example, financial support, not because we have money, but we don't need financial support to be provided to Russia. I mean the Kremlin, because they will steal it. We need more and more pressure, and we need this government to go. That's it, the end of story. Yes, of course, it's possible to put pressure now or a bit later in regard with Georgia and in regard with Donbass, and keep the situation. Putin is in the corner, and from this corner, you can, like, by putting more and more and more pressure, you can make the whole regime leave finally. Thanks.
Right. Let me now use the remaining time for the questions of our viewers, and there are 2 or 3 questions related to the relations between the federal, let's say, authorities, Mr. Putin, and the regions. How are these relations going to develop? Is there any sort of a chance for alternatives for Mr. Putin's lying in the regions? So anybody of you who would like to take on this point, please feel free.
Yeah, what they did now, they tried to put some responsibility for regional authorities, saying that they should cope with the problem, and at least publicly saying that they're giving them some additional funds. So unfortunately, we see it all the time, and we see it now in different regions, that authorities, for example, businesses that are connected with local authorities, they're working, they're open, they're not under quarantine rules, and other businesses are closed. And it's not only in, for example, Vladikavkaz, there it is so for 100%, but in other regions, villages, cities as well. So if it's connected to some oligarch, or if it's connected to some local governor or mayor and etc., it works. If it's not, they just close it, because of the pandemic. So I think that now, of course, Putin is trying to put responsibility on local authorities not to have the damage from coronavirus on his image. He will not have a chance to avoid it, and of course the support will be smaller and smaller. But before this vote for constitutional changes, they will punish governors, they will punish mayors, they will say that they lost something or failed somewhere, and etc., to have a minimum damage to their own image before constitutional changes voting. And I'm sure it will work, unfortunately, because propaganda and disinformation not give population the opportunity to see the real picture.
Ambassador Herbst, he's raising physically the hand, so yes, please go ahead.
I agree with Yegor that Mr. Putin has dumped responsibility on the regions in order to avoid blame for this, but it's unavoidable for him. It's clear that Russia has always existed with a strong vertical of power, with Moscow making major decisions across the country. We have seen periods in the past, for example, demonstrations against car import fees in the Russian Far East, in Vladivostok. This ploy by Mr. Putin will give governors ideas in the regions to take more authority. It doesn't mean that they'll actually do it, but you can't rule it out. So I see this crisis as shaking Mr. Putin's regime, at least somewhat, but not in any way predicting the demise as a result of this.
Right. I got 2 more questions. I would put them together. One of them is related to your expectations of the future of the Euro-Asian Economic Union, and a kind of a related question: how do you see the future relations between Belarus and Russia, and especially between Mr. Lukashenko and Mr. Putin?
It's my favorite one, so I have to. Look. Firstly, you should recall that many years ago the idea of a kind of special partnership between the evolving Eurasian Union and the European Union has been a kind of pet idea for Putin. Fundamentally, he started with this idea many years ago. But with his aggression against us, against Ukraine, it's gone. It's nowhere. Now he's been trying to persuade politicians, everywhere in Europe, in France especially, in Italy, but in Austria, about the necessity to resuscitate this idea. It's not going to happen. Because firstly, Eurasian Union is nowhere. You know, we can talk about other formats, we can talk about Shanghai, but Eurasian Union as such is nowhere in the sense of added value and sense of direction. With all kind of bickering, Kazakhstan, you know, Belarus, Russia, Armenia, it's not going somewhere, because fundamentally it's the idea for Russia to impose its agenda. But under current circumstances, it's a way to nowhere. So fundamentally, I don't have you know, any special prospects or you know, ideas about the Eurasian Union becoming a player. It's still Russia playing and trying to project.
So is anybody of you still willing to address this issue, the future of the Euro-Asian Economic Union and the future of the Russia-Belarus, Putin-Lukashenko's relations? Yes, Yegor.
Yeah, just a few words about this Eurasian Union. You know, it's built for making bordering countries, neighboring countries, be just closer to the Kremlin regime. We see not very well level of cooperation between Russia and Armenia now. We see that Azerbaijan, for example, Kremlin was trying to make Azerbaijan join all of these unions many times, and Azerbaijan have tensions with Russia as well. So because of new elites in Baku being in the process of taking power, they have problems with Kazakhstan. So I don't think that even with no regard to coronavirus, pandemic, and etc., this union is something really effective for its members. And it's like another one more tool of Kremlin to make these neighboring countries dependent, to make these neighboring countries be closer and listen what they need to listen from the Kremlin from their point of view. I don't think it could succeed in the future.
Right. So I will have a very last question to maybe all of you. That's a kind of provocative question from one of our viewers who is asking the following question. Isn't that alternative to Mr. Putin, the kind of totally devastating chaos, protest of starving people, worse than having still Mr. Putin in place? I know it's very, very simplistic question, but please go ahead, Mr. Ambassador Herbst.
I'm not advocating the removal of Mr. Putin. Let's start with that. But he is an authoritarian leader who has not done well for the Russian people and who is a revisionist foreign policy operator, which means he's dangerous and needs to be thwarted. In Russian history, there have been periods of chaos following the end of a major ruler. There have also been periods, those periods of chaos have been brief, and usually, again, when Russia has lost a war, we've seen a more liberal government take over. So I don't think the alternative to Mr. Putin is something worse. It's just something different.
Thank you, Ambassador Herbst. Any of our panelists would like to address this issue? Yes, Pavlo?
Look, I actually agree with John on that, but once I got a question from one of my friends. He is actually from Denmark about the sense of the Russian mentality, which could be changed after such a personal reload. And my point was very simple. After all these years of propaganda, if you simply switch off Russian TV for 6 months, it's not going to bring a kind of fundamental change to Russian mentality. Collective Putin, or collective Russian model will be still there. And I also believe that the alternative to Putin, and again, because we don't know whether this alternative could be better or worse. So it's a pure speculation here, but it could be just different. I believe that really many within the Russian elites now understand quite clearly that this model is not sustainable anymore. It's too ideologically outdated. It's simply not fitting. It could not be plugged in this reality. And of course, many understand that this, magic idea of the triangle, Russia, United States, China, is not there anymore. It's simply not there anymore. So there should be a different way to play a role for Russia and basically to shape up internal politics in Russia. And Putin probably is the wrong person for that. A big reload is not he could bring up. So, but my point, I fully agree with John. The alternative should be different, not worse or better here. It should be different in the sense of feeling in a different way for Russia, not going and feeling backwards, but feeling basically in the future. Whether it's a good future for Ukraine, for example, it's a very difficult point for me. But it should be completely different in the sense of understanding Russia, understanding the sense of the Russian regions basically interacting in the sense of projecting Russian role. It should be something completely different. And here again, I agree with John, 100%.
Thank you, Pavlo Klymkin. Now let's give the floor to Rebecca, who would also like to say probably the closing remarks on that issue.
So I'm not sure whether I can do it in the adequate way to close this session, but I would like to say that so to judge a leader only under these patterns, whether he's able to avoid chaos or not, is very poor, especially if a leader, president, authoritarian president is in power for so long time. And so sometimes I feel in Western European countries too much surrounded by people who echo this, who always say, but he avoids chaos. He is managing Russia in an orderly way, at least. They forget that poverty is a huge problem in Russia. And as I said in the very beginning, Corona crisis will bring to the light the weaknesses and the strengths of a system. And I think we will see some very, very negative results produced in the Putin system in Russia.
Right. Thank you, Rebecca. Last but not least, Yegor, I see your hand raised. So yes, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to say that for me and for my friends and everyone I know in Russia, it is putting people in jail for posting something on Facebook. It is a chaos. 20+ million people in Russia without ability to buy food. This is a chaos. Killing Ukrainians and Russians, killing Georgians and Russians. This is a chaos. And yes, we will survive somehow the chaos of Putin leaving his position as a president after 20 years. And we can go through it, of course, because it won't be worse. It's already, for majority of people, it's not very well. It's not good. It's bad. And our hospitals were not renewed after Soviet Union time. So it is a chaos now, and we must go out from this chaos to escape. And for this, unfortunately, I don't know how, I don't know when, I can't predict it, but this government should leave. And we have very strong leaders to lead the country, from elite, from different communities. We have them, we really do. You don't need to think that there are no leaders in Russia. There are lots of them. with normal understanding of how should normal country look like.
Thank you very much, Yegor. And we will finish here. So thank you both, our fantastic speakers. Thank you, our audience, for watching this joint European Values and Atlantic Council's Eurasia-centered online talk. We are very happy to, especially to our panelists, for sharing your thoughts with us. And let's hope and let's pray for the better future of Russians, for better future of Russia, so that we will have democratic Russia, the one that we all think about and dream about. So let's continue our work towards this objective. And once again, have an all nice day, and thank you very much, and hope to talk to you soon.